The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. A game that is remembered by many as the one Zelda game that changed everything. For many, it is a fond memory of their youth. A time when they sat on the couch playing their brand new Nintendo 64 for the very first time. And since Nintendo ended up remaking it for the 3DS, there was an entirely new generation that grew up with it. Time after time, it was hailed as a masterpiece, being the best Nintendo could ever do with the world of Hyrule and the Zelda franchise as a whole. But was it really that good? Well, maybe. We will never really get an answer anyway. Everything is based on subjective opinions, and humans are inherently flawed, so finding an answer to this question is nothing more than an endless journey with no purpose. So, what will we do then? Well, we could look at the very first dungeon, the inside of the Great Deku Tree. It was everyone's first impression of the game after all, so it's time to enter the dying Great Deku Tree to see how good of a dungeon it really is. Here we are, the very first room of the dungeon, the first thing anyone sees when entering. And so it begins. And is it off to a good start? Well, yes, because one important thing happened at the very start of all of this that no one really pays attention to. And both you and I just saw it. Do you know what I'm talking about? No? Really? Alright, roll back the video. This is what I'm talking about. While it might seem irrelevant, it actually plays a major role in subtly and unconsciously informing the player of where they can go and what they can do. Because in this room, your main goal is going all the way up and then jumping down to break the big spiderweb covering the hole below, which is perfectly illustrated in this little intro. So you know your goal and where you must go. Well, sort of. So you try to get there, and along the way you will encounter some minor challenges like Deku Babas, spiders, and Deku Scrubs. Nothing that's too difficult for the player, and almost all these mechanics aren't new to you. You even get hints from characters like Navi on what you're supposed to do. And then, after a short while, you get the slingshot. It's the only place where you can go after all. You can't really climb up because of the spiders. Unless you do some trickery, but in the end you always need the slingshot. And as soon as you have it, you need to use it in order to get out of the room where you got it from, showing the player what they can do with it. And now that you have the slingshot, you can get up there, clear a couple more rooms with some minor combat and platforming sections, and then finally finish the plan, jumping through the web down below. This is the very first section of the dungeon. Overall, not bad. Clearly Nintendo showed you what you could do and gave many hints. But still, they also introduced some fun, low-stake challenges, like fighting the Deku Babas and the small platforming sections in certain rooms. This is actually something Nintendo does a lot. They introduce some ideas or mechanics in an environment where the player can mess up and try again without any huge penalties. We even saw stuff like this in the most recent Zelda titles, as well as Super Mario games. Nintendo has always kind of done this, and as soon as you, the player, got through all of this successfully, they will start to ramp up the difficulty. And that is going to happen right now in the lower levels of the dungeon. Here, things become a lot harder because they take all the mechanics that were seen before to the next step, and they won't help you as much. And as you could have noticed, the main mechanics of this dungeon are the following. Fire, which you have to deal with as soon as you get down there because otherwise you won't get past these webs. Combat challenges, for example the Deku Scrubs and Babas. Some minor platforming stuff seen in rooms like this, and of course puzzles involving buttons and the slingshot. Still relatively simple stuff, but everything down here is a bit harder than it was up there, allowing the player to get better at all these things, which is quite crucial actually. You might think, who cares, Wily? It's just some basic stuff. This dungeon isn't important to the game at all. And you might be right to an extent when saying that, but in the end, this place was added to the game as some sort of training ground for the player. So overcoming all of this was an important step in starting your adventure in the great world of Hyrule. If this place wasn't in the game, your first 4 hours of playing Ocarina of Time would be very different, believe me. In general, you would be a lot less experienced and struggle a lot more when taking on the bigger challenges this game has to offer later on. And after you do a little run around on the second floor where you first encounter combat, then some platforming with a puzzle, and then once again combat, you end up on the other side from where you started. And here you again need to get rid of a web covering a hole, but this time with fire, instead of jumping down from a great height, which actually leads you to your final two challenges. First a puzzle, and then a big combat trial in the form of a boss fight. But let's start with the puzzle. This one is quite easy if you paid attention, since the Deku scrub from before gave you the answer. However, regardless of that, this is Nintendo's ultimate puzzle challenge for this dungeon, which also tests your combat skills in a way. Now sure, it's not too hard, but remember this is the very first dungeon after all, so all Nintendo wants is for people to get familiar with the concepts of the game, and a puzzle like this will be seen in dungeons later on as well, but more complex versions of it. Think of the 4 Poe sisters in the Force Temple, for example. That's basically a significantly more elaborate version of this. So this is kind of a setup for something much bigger we would see later on in dungeons. And after you finally crack the code, you will go on to encounter the Beast. Goma, the final boss of this dungeon. This is a huge parasite that was slowly killing the great Deku tree, bit by bit. And since you were sent in to defeat it, this is your final challenge. This is the thing Nintendo presents to you before you're allowed to take the next step in your grand adventure. And during this fight, Nintendo actually made it clear to the player how dungeons would function in this game. And all this time, they've been building towards this. Because you have to use the slingshot to stun him, which was the dungeon item that you had to use throughout the entire place actually. And so the player could see, even if they didn't fully realize it, how dungeons were designed by Nintendo. First, you enter. Then you get introduced to some of the core mechanics of the dungeon. Eventually, you find the one dungeon item. After getting that, you use it to progress, and ultimately also use it to defeat the boss. And then you're done. And the Great Deku Tree Dungeon is the introduction to this whole cycle, and it does a pretty good job at showing all of this. Now the fight with Goma is pretty straightforward. You just stun him with a slingshot or maybe a Deku Nut and then attack. Overall, it's nothing to write home about, to be honest. But still, for a first boss, it wasn't bad really. And after you finally beat him, you were allowed to enter the gigantic world, starting your adventure for real. And this place was just there to give you a taste of what you would face later on in the game. So in the end, was this a good first dungeon for a game like Ocarina of Time? One that is held in such high regard? In my opinion, yes. And that's for multiple reasons actually. And the most important one is context. Just think about it. This game was released in the year 1998 on the Nintendo 64, the very first 3D console that the company ever made. So most people who played this game back then never really played a 3D game, or were even used to controlling and working with it. And so Nintendo had to make sure that people understood how it all functioned, and what was even possible in a game like this. That's why the introduction area of Kokiri Forest, as well as the Great Deku Tree, were so incredibly crucial. They were there to test and hone your skills, so you would be able to take on the real challenges of this game. And the story surrounding the dungeon and why you had to clear it also set the rest of the game in motion, since the Great Deku Tree ended up dying and wanted you to stop the great evil that was attacking the world of Hyrule. So even from a story perspective, it did a pretty great job at getting the ball rolling, as well as preparing the player for what was to come. So while we may never really find out if Ocarina of Time was truly an objective 10 out of 10, we can be certain that Nintendo did their very best. And in the end, this was mostly remembered. A video game company tackling a huge project that was mostly foreign to them, as well as the people who they were making it for. But in the end, all of us were able to play and enjoy The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like this video, click in the upper right corner for more videos, click subscribe and the bell button so you won't miss anything, leave a comment naughty or nice, and I will see you all in the next one.